So from my very first days working in the US intelligence community more than a decade ago, I worked on foreign policy implications and security implications of issues like climate change and water security and food security and similar issues. And these are issues typically found under what's called environmental security. As a complex systems physicist, I naturally gravitate to ecology anyway because of the way that ecologists and the field thinks about systems and systems thinking. And what struck me over time was how climate change and water stress were increasingly being perceived as national security issues, while the declining state of the biosphere, which of course humanity is embedded in and deeply intertwined with, was basically a zero profile issue. Ecological disruption and climate change are not mere environmental issues that are somehow separate from human and societal concerns. And in fact, they're perhaps the two most rather pressing issues facing us.
So I spent years in the US intelligence community, and I led teams there that looked at Africa and the Middle East, and we looked at issues of conflict and terrorism and governance issues. But time and again, as we did our analysis, what we found is that the real drivers behind some of the conflict and instability were ecological and climate related. But however, when we put that in our analysis, we'd often get some pushback from senior leaders who didn't fully see the links between things, say, like biodiversity and conflict. So that really sparked my interest and focus in digging in deeper on the issue. And what I'm most passionate about in this area is ensuring that the national security community fully integrates these issues into their work. That they're not just considered, those soft issues handled by someone else, the scientists over there, but that they're part and parcel of the day-to-day work of being a national security person in the US government. And I think if there's anything we've learned from this past pandemic year is that these quote unquote soft issues can't be overlooked, that they must be part of the conversation. And we need to expand our definition of national security in such a way to better encompass them and tackle them. And when I think about the kind of world that I want to leave behind for my kids, I want it to be one where our government puts its resources and efforts into tackling the most pressing threats we face.
Since I was a kid, I spent a great deal of time traveling around the United States, visiting national parks, enjoying the great outdoors, and observing the magnificence of the wildlife around me. Before joining the Council on Strategic Risks, I spent more than a decade working in the Department of Defense, including a 3-year stint at the Pentagon. Although I've spent the majority of my career exploring threats posed by the tools of conflict, I've always been interested in the underlying sources of conflict between countries, which I believe will become more and more climate change and ecological disruption. For me, environmental crime and illegal trade in wildlife is an especially interesting nexus between ecology and national security. The type of government corruption typically associated with these practices undermines the rule of law and destabilizes a country, which leads it to become more prone to military conflict. If we want to prevent countries from engaging in military conflict in the first place, then we must begin by addressing these critical problems.
Without sounding cliche, what first drew me to ecological security was a marriage of two core issues that had always interested me. Ecological issues, be it environmental, also along kind of a similar line, energy issues, and then security. And bringing that together was always what I was the most interested in. It's difficult to choose one pathway under the ecological security umbrella that I'm most passionate about. It's something that really fascinates me across the board. But if I were to choose one pathway, it would be the ecological, biological, and security nexus. I think that, especially considering where we're finding ourselves today, which is a year past a global pandemic, this is going to be something we're going to be dealing with again. One of my core interests along that is preparing for complex emergencies and scenarios, and this nexus falls directly into that. This is an area that we will need to invest much more in preparing in adaptation and resiliency efforts around the world.
Most of the public debate in the United States and elsewhere really treats the planetary crisis as one issue among many, basically an abstraction that occasionally makes it to the front page of the newspaper or the evening news broadcasts. And this is less true of climate change, which is slowly and finally rising to a position of deserved prominence in our discourse. But with respect to ecological disruption, such as extinctions of species and populations and the collapse of ecosystem function, we don't hear much from our national leaders. We don't have a leaders summit on biosphere integrity, for example. But just as an astronaut can't survive long in the stratosphere without her spacesuit, humanity cannot exist on a hostile planet rocketing through space without the rest of the biosphere that our own species evolved into. So to our knowledge, this was the first report to analyze and articulate the national security dimensions of ecological disruption, especially threats to biosphere integrity. And we argue in the report that U.S. national security needs to be redefined to better address and respond to actorless security threats such as ecological disruption, climate change, pandemic risk, etc. The report is a first step towards analyzing the pathways between elements of ecological disruption and human, national, and global security outcomes. We looked at stresses to water, food, wildlife, fisheries, forests, and ecosystem services writ large, and how they lead to things like political instability and conflict, crime, corruption, infectious diseases, disruptive migration, and the like. The task for policymakers and security professionals is to better understand and navigate the rocky road that's already been put in place by past and ongoing actions. For Pillar 1, why and how do we need to go deeper to examine ecological risks in terms of analysis? There are many issues to be examined, but I'll focus just on two. In our report, we discuss the framework of ecosystem services, which are the suite of benefits that natural systems provide to humanity, which ecological economists use to estimate monetary equivalents to ecological damage. And as we point out in the report, such a focus on purely monetary evaluation of these ecosystem services is itself a negative factor in biosphere instability. And what we really need to understand is how a breakdown in these ecological systems, whether it's pollination or soil quality regulation or genetic resources, affects people and the rest of the planet. And that is a purposeful expansion of looking at consequences of loss of ecosystem function. And the second aspect is a better understanding of the reverberations that arrive from systems that undergo so-called ecological regime shifts, or when an ecosystem flips to another state. It's a broad term that incorporates fisheries collapse and changes in river course, which are easy, or at least easier, to conceptualize in traditional security terms. But regime shifts also include transitions in kelp forests and salination of soil, a switch from normal marine systems to instances of low oxygen or hypoxia. These are topics essentially never discussed in a security context until our report. But so much more analysis is needed on these important shifts that are underway.
In Pillar 2, we're creating a community of practice, a community that does not yet exist. And this group would bring together experts that more typically than not do not interact or really work with each other. And these include epidemiologists, ecologists, climate scientists, experts such as in the security fields, tech fields, geopolitical experts, corporate community leaders, and other relevant stakeholders. We think a community of practice is critical in making progress in ecological security because it brings together people who otherwise would not really be in the same room to discuss these security issues. Fostering this interaction between diverse stakeholders who would rarely connect or discuss these intersections is, we believe, a cornerstone of analysis and, of course, of action, which is the most important part of this community and working group. This allows stakeholders to think about things differently, maybe in a way that they had never really analyzed an issue before, and be informed by each other's works. And we think it's really the first step of pushing these issues forward, is getting these people to have conversations, exchange ideas, facilitate innovation, bring in technology. It's really, in my opinion, an absolute critical step in addressing any kind of converging risks work. CSR is home to several working groups and communities of practice, including our Climate Security Working Group, which has been bringing together experts for the better part of a decade and has truly established kind of a leading voice in climate security issues, both in the US and we'd say around the world. Another working group that is near and dear to my heart is the Working Group of Climate, Nuclear, and Security Affairs. We developed this concept over 4 or 5 years ago and really built it from the ground up. We really brought together an incredible group of stakeholders and experts and facilitated these incredibly important conversations. We created a community, and many of our experts still talk to each other. They're still talking about ideas and ways that we could move this work forward. So we believe at CSR that we really are the best organization to create a group of experts that haven't previously been connected with each other and really lay the groundwork for growth in the years to come.
So for Pillar 3, what we're focusing on is building an Ecological Security Fellowship program, because we believe to truly achieve transformation in our national security process and really center those ecological security issues, we need to build a bench of leaders that have an understanding of how these issues work and why they're important. We need to catch people like me early in their careers, folks with security backgrounds, but who kind of think, oh, this ecological issue is important. We need to bring them in, mentor them, give them the expertise they need to know how to bring the ecological issues to the fore. At the same time, we need to reach folks with scientific backgrounds who really have a deep understanding of biodiversity loss, of other ecological issues, but perhaps have an interest in policymaking and being part of the solution in addressing these issues. We want to bring those folks in too and get them to understand the security dynamics, the security community, get them the mentoring they need to perhaps go into government or go into other leadership positions to be able to advance change on these issues. Because that's really the only way we're going to transform, is through the people involved in the process. We know the approach of fellows programs works at the Council on Strategic Risks because we have a track record of successful programs in both the climate security and the biological threat space. One of our very first climate security fellows works in the Pentagon's Office of Peacekeeping and Stability Operations. After she completed our fellows program, she went on to found a community of interest within the Department of Defense called the Resource Competition, Environmental Security and Stability Group that brought together folks from across the agency that cared about climate and security issues. She did this during the Trump administration when climate change was not front and center. And then when the Biden administration came in and was committed to tackling climate security, her group has been at the vanguard within the Pentagon of making sure they had people in place who could lead on these issues. And she did that large part because she was part of our fellows program. And that's the kind of success we've had with these fellows programs and would want to replicate with the Ecological Security Fellows.
Now more than ever, for a project like this one to have impact that leads to action, we need to ensure that it sustains visibility throughout its duration. In Pillar 4, we will develop an innovative communication strategy. We will produce a series of podcasts, blog posts, videos, and infographics. I like to call these shareables. Why? Because they're bound to get more retweets and shares than a lengthy report. This type of content will catch people's attention, bring them into contact with our analytical work, and raise awareness of ecological security. By designing content to reach a broader audience, we will give policymakers and thought leaders powerful tools to articulate topics that are typically laden with complex science and jargon. This way, I believe we can reach beyond the fields of ecology and climate change to include those within the defense and security communities and make them part of the conversation.